Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Today's event is by the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. We are very glad to have Karin Limburg as our speaker today. She's a distinguished professor in the Department of Environmental and Forest Biology at SUNY ESF, that's Environmental Sciences and Forestry. She is widely regarded as one of the top researchers in her field, and also one of the originators of ecological economics, having been influential in our field as well. And we are extremely grateful and happy that she's able to speak today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. A couple of corrections. One is that my department changed its name, finally recognizing that forests are part of the environment. So we are just the Department of Environmental Biology now.
Sorry.
And second, I wasn't one of the founders of ecological economics. I was around the founders. I was near the founders. Some of my mentors were founders, but yeah, with the sands of time, I guess it doesn't really matter so much. So I'm going to go ahead now and give you a little presentation about what I do. So these days, folks, I haven't really engaged too much explicitly with ecological economics in a while. But I think that we might all agree that it sort of permeates a lot of what we do, whether it's implicit or not. And so what I've been involved with for the last, I guess about 9 years in a formal sense is to be active with a group of scientists who are trying to communicate and foster and encourage research in a growing problem in the environment, which is it's based on climate change and pollution, basically together. I think I'm going to move a little closer to the house and just hang out on the stoop, maybe. So you guys are going to get to see just kind of a messy house in a minute, but that's okay. At least the bandwidth should be better here. But anyway, so the problem that I've been engaged with even longer than that is looking at the effects of oxygen loss in aquatic ecosystems, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen, and hopefully there's enough time towards the end to engage in a little discussion and so on. So I just like to hide the meeting controls. That's good. And kind of hide things away from me. So this is my presentation, and it is something I hope is comprehensible to everybody, even if you are not an ecological, if you're not into aquatic science. Now, let me just see one thing here. I've got a little obstruction in my own view that I want to hide. There we go. Okay, so I've just hidden the floating meeting control so I can actually see. So SUNY ESF you heard about. I also have a part-time gig at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, which is in Swedish called SLU, or Sveriges Lantbruksuniversitet. It's a little bit like an ag school or a Cornell type school, but I'm affiliated with the Department of Aquatic Resources, which is actually it's about 2/3 of the former Fishery Board of Sweden, which was dismantled 10 years ago. And the research and monitoring parts were put into the university. So overnight, it became the largest department at this particular university, and it's called SLU Aqua. It's been great for me. I'm actually half Swedish, and it takes me to both my roots, but also very interesting research. But to open this up a little bit more, let's see if I can just get the screen working here. I thought I'd go back in time a little bit and show pictures from a really interesting and fun research project I did, which blended stream ecology with ecological economics. And the fellow at the lower left there, you might recognize, he's your current president of the USSEE. His advisors are in the center, John Gowdy, another president of the or the International Society, I believe, of Ecological Economics, and then at lower right, John Erickson, who is a former president of USSEE, and then Glenn Murray Lang up top, who is just retired as being an economist at the World Bank, but she's also a very important ecological economist or environmental economist. Developed a lot in environmental accounting for the UN. And you'll notice here that they're actually taking measurements. And I went to a talk once in a fisheries meeting where an economist got up and said, well, you know, I'm an economist, we don't make measurements. And then I got up and said, well, actually, our economists do make measurements, and here's the pictures to prove it. So and then Karin Limburg up here in the upper left, she's my former student, and now she's one of the somewhat higher ups at the New York DEC. So we have this in common. We are ecological economists. We're catching fish and we're measuring dissolved oxygen. So it's a good intro, I thought. And those are eels on the bottom. Also very important, but that's another story. So the outline of my talk is like this: climate change, properties of water and oxygen. What the heck is deoxygenation? What is hypoxia? What are the causes and the scope of it? What are the impacts? And then a couple of short case studies, and then a question for you. And this may be, if some of you are new to ecological economics, you might not think about this much at all, but one of the things I've been tasked with in my role as part of this international working group of scientists is to think about the ecosystem services that are affected by deoxygenation. And they don't necessarily have to be lost. They can be things that are gained as well, but I think on balance, probably we lose more than we gain, at least in the long run. So this is a graph here this is a typical graph of temperature in a deep water column. So this would be in the ocean. It goes down to 7,000 meters, and you can see that there's a decrease in temperature. But what happens is, I just thought this was a useful graph just to talk about temperature. But what happens with water is when water warms, it actually expands. So it's it becomes less dense, it becomes lighter. So warmer water would tend to ride on top of colder water, for one thing. And that leads to a phenomenon that's very commonly observed in lakes and estuaries too, called stratification. And it's also can occur in the world's oceans too. And it occurs in most water subject to warming, and that's what's happening in the world right now. I heard that somebody's logged in from Miami, and of course Miami had 100-degree water around it last summer, which is just shocking. But then the depth where this change is rapid is called a thermocline, and that's what this is right here. So this is where you have a very rapid change. And you can have changes like that in other things too, like other physical parameters, like the salinity of water, the density of water, the oxygen content, and so on. So dissolved oxygen, most aquatic higher life forms really depend on oxygen. So that could be your fish, of course. Not all fish are, all fish I'd say it's through dependent on oxygen, but some are more adapted to lower oxygen than others, but by and large, most are not. Oxygen is a gas, of course, that dissolves into water, and the amount of oxygen that water can hold is a function of both temperature and salinity. So warmer water holds less oxygen, and salinity, salty water holds less oxygen too. So that's illustrated in this graph from a company that sells meters, oxygen and salinity meters. And you can see that as the temperature goes up, the concentration of oxygen declines. And in seawater, it would be lower than in fresh water. So that would be the seawater and then the fresh water. So you can get the general picture here of what can happen. So then the question is, what is hypoxia? And some of you may be familiar with the medical definition that it's a condition where people's tissues don't get sufficient oxygen, therefore the cells are stressed. But in environmental science, we define it as low oxygen in water. And although there are really different organisms have different sensitivities to low oxygen, but operationally for regulation, it's often defined as 2 milligrams of oxygen per liter. And of course, oceanographers and environmental scientists all use different units. So I've also put other units here. The European environmental scientists use milliliters per liter. So that's actually a little bit lower number than the one that's favored by Americans, I guess. And then oceanographers use micromoles per liter. So this is the same. These are all the same threshold. That's supposed to be an image of dead animals on the bottom from no oxygen. But as I said, in reality, many organisms are affected at different levels. So in fact, I was just at a conference out in Long Island just this week, looking at research in Long Island Sound. And one of the big problems there has been hypoxia over time. It was really, really bad in the 90s, 80s and 90s. And the EPA jumped in and started a massive program to remediate the problems at a watershed scale, a multiple watershed scale. But their working thresholds are actually higher than this one. But this one is kind of a sort of around the globe. It's a recognized threshold for regulation. But another thing that one of my colleagues did that I thought was kind of effective, and I use this in class, is just to show the difference in how much mass of oxygen there is in air versus water. So we're oxygen breathers, of course, and we breathe it from air. And so the mass of 1 liter of air would be 1.3 grams, and 21% of that would be 0.3 grams. But 1 liter of seawater, because it's saline, it weighs a bit more than fresh water. And you can see that numerically it holds far, far less oxygen than air does. And half saturation is a very low number. And then of course 0 grams would be anoxia. So that's the operational term. And then as global warming increases, not only does water hold less oxygen, but it stratifies more. And that one of the results of that is that water columns, water bodies that have more stratification have a harder time re-aerating because they can't mix as well with the atmosphere. And believe it or not, that's actually happening in the world's oceans in large areas. And this process of oxygen loss in all water bodies is called deoxygenation. And we got quite a bit of attention focused on that in 2018 with a big paper that was led by Denise Breitberg, published in Science. And this graph, I don't know how many times I've seen this graph being used. Even Al Gore showed it at a conference. And all the dots are hypoxic zones along basically along coastline, so coastal hypoxia. But all the dark blue areas, and if you added up all those areas, they sum up to an area greater than Africa completely. And these areas are called oxygen minimum zones, the ones in blue. And what happens is that around 400 to 1,000 meters or so, there's a loss of oxygen. That's really caused a lot by the lack of re-aeration and the inability for waters to mix, oxygen-rich water to mix in. It actually becomes higher below that. So don't forget that the oceans can be thousands of meters deep. You'll also notice that there's, although some of the most populous countries in the world are China and India, that there are relatively few points around them. And part of that is because of just lack of information getting out. There's actually there's some hesitation to publish some of that information. But one thing that we do know is that this is spreading quite rapidly. So in the 70s, really it was documented in a number of countries that were probably had more science, more environmental scientists. So really not very much seen, but it was also in an era of developing eutrophication, which is the enrichment of water with nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And by the 2000s, though, that's been increasing quite a bit. And now there's certainly over 700 hypoxic zones that are defined, but probably closer to 1,100 by now, I think. Bob Diaz and Rutger Rosenberg published a nice paper which reported the change over time, over decades, in numbers of dead zones, and I colored it in by the global world production value. So there you can see that, in fact, this has a linkage to human activity too. And in fact, this actually, I found this graph from NOAA, and I thought this was a really nice way to look at this, because this shows you the hypoxic zones and the little dots. It also shows you areas of these, it shows you to some extent these oxygen minimum zones, but what they really are showing is particulate organic matter. So that's from algae that bloom and die and decay and decompose. And you'll see more of that in a minute. But the other cool thing is that this shows you crop production in throughout the world. And what you can see is that the places that receive that water coming off of the crop production, those are hypoxic areas. So this is, of course, the Mississippi drainage, or this graph or this map of North America does mirror a lot of the production in the Mississippi itself, which drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. So the causes of hypoxia, this graph is from our kind of summary for policymakers document from our Global Ocean Oxygen Network. And this is just meant to depict sort of a number of the different processes, the physics and a little of the biology too. This graph over here on the left shows you this oxygen minimum zone that declines here around 400 to 1,000 meters and then goes back up again. And what's been found is, by budget analysis, is that the world's oceans have lost about 2% of their oxygen since the mid-20th century. Now, 2% doesn't sound like much, but let's not forget how big the ocean is. This is an enormous amount. And recently a paper came out looking at doing sort of a synthesis analysis of temperate lakes throughout the world, and found that it seems to be the bottom layers of lakes have declined 5 to 30%, something like that. So I've just wrote greater than 10% on average, which is a lot. It's a lot of oxygen loss. So in coastal hypoxia, so this would be, and this I think can also be extended to lakes and ponds as well, is that you get excess nutrients from, and that's really from human activity in general, and that leads to stimulation of primary productivity. So that would produce blooms of algae, that's tiny the microscopic plants in the water. Once they bloom, they die, and the cells decay, fall to the bottom and decay, and microbes use up the oxygen. And if there's not if there are hindrances to replenishment, then this can be a problem. In the ocean, as I mentioned before, you get stratification, so you get lack of re-aerating those deeper waters, and that leads to these oxygen minimum zones. But the oceans, of course, are complex with complex hydrodynamics, and some areas, but it's so meaning that this is fairly patchy, I guess. The most famous one, I think, that you might have seen in the news is the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. And I'm not going to play this video for you, but I think in the recording, at least you can probably write this down and you can watch it. And it's a colleague of mine named Nancy Rabelais a professor at LSU, and she gave a really good TED talk about the process that leads to deoxygenation in the Gulf of Mexico. And she also is the person who's been sort of the spokeswoman for bringing attention of this to the public and other scientists and regulators, and has been really instrumental in working with farm associations and EPA and NOAA and everybody to reduce nutrient input from all of these parts of the Mississippi drainage that end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And this dead zone has extended at times to exceed the size of the state of New Jersey, which is impressive. Okay, so biological production, that's everything from the nanoplankton, which are 10 to the minus, well, picoplankton, even 10 to the minus 15th meters, up to kelp forests. Everything fixes carbon and produces oxygen. That's the process of photosynthesis, and that really fuels the food webs that form our biosphere in the oceans and other aquatic systems. But the excess nutrients from things like agricultural runoff or sewage from cities and so on can produce massive algal blooms. So this is just reiterating what I just said before. Dies, decays, and consumes oxygen. But this is an example from the Baltic Sea, which where I do a lot of my own research on this topic. And what we're seeing in the satellite image is the island of Gotland, which was actually a site of some early ecological economics research. And around it are massive blooms of blue-green algae. And so as they die and decay, it's exported to the bottom as organic matter, OM, and then microbial decomposition happens. And I pulled these data out of a very nice database that Sweden has for an area that's just over here a bit to the east of Gotland. It's called the Gotland Deep. It's one of the best monitored stations. And what you can see here is that over the last 20 years or so, we've seen changes in pH and oxygen. So the color coding goes from it's kind of a weird scale, but it goes from high oxygen and high pH down to low oxygen and low pH. And this is also highlights something that I think is very important to realize, is that deoxygenation is kind of the flip side of the coin of ocean acidification. So ocean acidification got a lot of news play, and a lot of research was stimulated on it, particularly when it was discovered that things like the tiny larvae that form the seed of oysters or clams for aquaculture they weren't able to form their shells because it was too acidic, and the physics of being able to pull the calcium out of the water didn't work anymore. And this is something that they're on the lookout for in the East Coast too, but this has happened in the West Coast, for example. And honestly, whether the news is about harmful algal blooms, which are also in the news a lot, ocean acidification, or dead zones, all of these things are connected, and we have a big part to play in that. Largely from, let's not forget what the big driver is actually the greenhouse gases that we continue to emit into the atmosphere. And so if there's any takeaway of what can I do, it would be write to your representatives and vote on this, because this is so critically important. So impacts, deoxygenation can affect whole ecosystems by reducing oxygen, right? The availability of it. And there can be biogeochemical feedbacks that can reinforce the cycle. So for example, one thing that can happen is that one of the critical nutrients to generate the algae that bloom is phosphorus. And phosphorus, in the algal cells, when they die and decay and sort of drift down to the bottom sediments, they're basically trapped in there. But when in a situation where you have low oxygen that eventually goes to no oxygen, anoxia, the biogeochemistry actually releases the phosphorus back up into the water column, and it can kick the process on again. And this is something that occurs in a lot of lakes. It happens in the Baltic Sea. I'm sure it happens in some other areas too. I think in the Chesapeake Bay, for example, and they call this a vicious cycle, of course. It can even enhance the availability of the toxic form of mercury, which is called methylmercury. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that in Q&A if anyone's interested, but I don't have time to talk about it right now. For fish and shellfish, there are varied impacts. As I mentioned before, some organisms are more resistant than others. Some are extremely sensitive. And so for fishes, for example, one of the things that can happen is that their living space, their habitat becomes compressed. There's just less good oxygen around. If they're more crowded into those areas, then you have what ecologists call density dependent effects, which are things like more competition or, more from crowding, you can have effects like contagion of disease and so on. And in extreme cases, of course, if they use up the oxygen, there's death. So that's what you mostly hear about is fish kills. You see that in the news, but in reality, there's a lot of sublethal effects, and the physiological effects are ubiquitous, I would say. So, like people, fish need oxygen to metabolize food and stored fat to power what they do throughout life. So it's really a metabolic story that we're going towards. So the reduced oxygen leads to a suite of impacts that sort of cascade on one another. So one of the things that happens is that their whole metabolism slows down. And one of the things that is energetically expensive is actually digesting food. So you yourselves may have noticed that after a big meal, you feel warm and fuzzy. Well, that's because your body is metabolizing. That's a well-known phenomenon. But cessation of feeding can happen. Poor avoidance of predators, perhaps harder time finding your prey, and impaired immune responses. So you might be more susceptible to infections and also just chronic weakness, I guess. Also under hypoxia, it's been shown that vision is affected. And I also have a feeling that that hearing may be affected as well. And we know that there's a few studies of that have shown that for acute hypoxia. But it's not just the oxygen concentration that we worry about. It's also the percent of saturation. So you can express oxygen or any gas dissolved in water as a percent of its saturation. So if the water is holding all that it can by virtue of partial pressure, so you might remember back to Henry's law of partial pressures, that would be 100%. But if it drops down, if the partial pressure drops down, that means that also the ability of oxygen to permeate into tissues drops down. So this is what physiologists actually worry about. And we measure that as percent saturation. Here's John Erickson holding, former president of USSEE, holding a sonde that was logging in oxygen as both concentration and percent saturation. So from the physiologist perspective, there's kind of a graph. Often you see a graph like this. It's not the laughing out loud, it's the limiting O2 level. And basically, life for everyone happens to go from somewhere between a standard metabolic rate. So this would be you're resting, no feeding, no nothing, sitting in a dark room, kind of rate, very calm, to maximum metabolic rate where you're screaming and yelling and whatever. But for fish, when they actually measure fish, they often chase them in a tank and get them exhausted so that you can see how much they respire, how much they take in. And so the difference between the maximum rate and the standard metabolic rate is called the aerobic metabolic capacity, or the scope, the aerobic scope of an animal. And if you change the saturation, as you go down in saturation, you actually march down this limiting oxygen level, and you can come down to a point where you can't do anything. Your scope is basically zero, and as you fall even below that, you go into your own personal dead zone, I guess you could say. But a lot of times this graph is shown with not oxygen saturation, but actually temperature on the graph too, or else they'll show different curves with oxygen saturation versus metabolic rate, but with different curves for temperature. So the warmer temperature would mean that your metabolic rate actually would, your metabolic demands would increase, but the actual saturation would decrease. So it's really sort of the worst of both worlds. And when you're in warmer water, it's losing oxygen, but you yourself have a greater need for oxygen as it gets warm. And for poikilotherms, that is fish and shellfish. So my case study then, just marching into this, is to look at a fish that is really a keystone charismatic fish. Not exactly the panda of the sea, but a fish that is considered very important around the world. Books have been written about it. And it is the Atlantic cod. And it's a very interesting fish from the perspective of history. It once was the most abundant fish, probably one of the most abundant fishes in the Atlantic Ocean. Certainly not anymore, but it is also highly adaptable to different environments. And the Baltic Sea itself is actually more like a giant estuary. It's huge. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. But it's a low salinity system, so it's not like the open Atlantic. But the cod is an iconic species. For those of you tuning in from New England, the State House of Massachusetts, where the government is has a cod hanging in the ceiling there. It is the symbol. It was the fish that really kept people going, but it's doing very poorly in the Baltic Sea from both warming and hypoxia. So this just shows you the bottom part of the Baltic Sea. The Baltic actually extends further north into a big, almost freshwater bay, but it's drained by 9 countries. 9 countries form around it, and the total area of the Baltic Sea, the surface area, is 1.7 times all of our Great Lakes combined. So it's a very large place. And another little factoid I like to explain to people is that this lagoon here, which is a famous lagoon in Europe, is its draining watershed, which is about here, is about 3/4 the size of the Chesapeake Bay. So it's the Chesapeake Bay drainage. So just to put things in scale, it's an enormous system. And what we're looking at here is a typical map that is, as it says here, it's the extent of hypoxic and anoxic bottom water. And this was published in early 2020. These are measured. The assessments are done in autumn, and by kriging analysis, they calculate the area and volumetric extent. And the gray zones show you hypoxia measured as with a threshold of 2 milliliters per liter, as they said the Europeans do. And the black is anoxia, but you might notice it says less than or equal to. So how can you have less than or equal to 0 oxygen? Well, it's because the biogeochemists also include other chemical processes that lead to more consumption of and reduction of organic matter, and that includes the reduction of hydrogen sulfate to hydrogen sulfide, which, if you remember your chemistry class, in high school, that is what generates that rotten egg smell. So I also like to explain it as if you had a rusty knife and you stuck it into the deep water here, it would unrust, because it would the iron rust would dissolve away, it would be reduced. So that's we're going to head into a little bit of biology and ecology and biogeochemistry in a sec. So these 4 zones here that you see are places that map onto these areas here. This is a map showing the spawning and nursery areas. So where the fry rear, where the adults reproduce and the fry rear, historically there were some pretty large areas of this, and nowadays the most of that is gone. Although there is some evidence that there's something going on up a little bit further north, but generally most of the population has been reduced severely to the southern Baltic, to a deep area that's not anoxic yet. So, and then although this is a bit of an exaggerated picture, it's shown a lot that there was a period in the 1980s when there were some very strong year classes of cod. And I guess this gentleman here was a fishery manager from Estonia. Apparently he just passed away, unfortunately. But he was obviously very, very pleased with this haul, and many big fish. A lot of them were over 15 years old, and nowadays they've shrunk. This is really the case now. In fact, I think the average size of cod now in the Baltic Sea is 25 centimeters, which is 10 inches. And the incidence of what the Swedes call necktie cods are, very, very thin cods in terrible condition has increased. It's not across the board, but it's just more common now because of food. So we're going to take a detour into one of my specialties, which is to look at chemistry within little structures in the heads of fishes that are called otoliths, which literally means ear stones, and they're part of the hearing and balance system. So this is the ear, and there are three of these. There's two pairs of semicircular canals and 3 pairs of these ear stones, and they grow in many sizes and shapes. This is from a very old cod here. They get very scalloped and ornate when they get older. But these are all from adults. So these are from adult alewives. This is a cod. This is a freshwater drum, a perch. I think this is some kind of a snapper, and so on. So they all accommodate the skeletal and muscular elements in the fish's head, and also they're adapted for different jobs, but they're involved in hearing. But from a fish biologist perspective, we like them because they're chronometers in fish heads. If you look at a larval fish, this is a Hudson River American shad larva. Its little otolith is right there, seen with cross-polarized light in a microscope. And if we look at it more closely, we can actually see these little rings on it. And these rings are laid down every day. So you can tell how old a fish larva is to the exact day, which is pretty amazing. And if you know the day it was caught, then you can back estimate its birthday too. At a larger scale, this is the only sort of really gross picture of a fish head. But this is from a salmon where I took the brain out, and you can see the little otoliths in there. If you pull those out, you can see these opaque zones of opaque and translucent zones, and those are a pair of those would correspond to a year's growth. So the first year here would be, this opaque, and then the winter, and then the next summer, the next winter, and they grow slower. They grow fast when they're young, and slower as they get older. But fish, unlike humans, grow throughout life, but just very, very slowly as they get much older. This is a cod otolith, and what we typically do is we make a cross section through it this way, which is called a transverse section. And then when we do that, we can see all these lovely rings and the ones that are in good health. But what's cool about it also is that we're actually having a look here from birth to death. So the otolith forms as a tiny little crumb and then grows throughout life. And so we have a complete record here from birth to all the way to death. So we can actually reconstruct childhood events and things like that. And we look a lot at chemical information. A lot of us look at chemical information, and it's a lot like trying to interpret a black box light recorder. Some things are obvious and some things are not so obvious. But it turns out that the otoliths can tell us something about exposure to hypoxia. And these are some modern cod otoliths, and these are actually from the Stone Age. I worked with an archaeologist who did her dissertation on Stone Age fisheries. And this little blob here is a pellet of the element manganese, and that plays a big role here. So this trace element manganese, it turns out when it's dissolved, it gets taken up over the gills. The fish breathe in the water, pass it over the gills, and trace elements come in along with the oxygen. But under conditions of low oxygen, it is in the dissolved form. Otherwise, it is particulate. Otherwise, just like iron. And the processes are called redox processes. But basically, you have something like this under good oxygen or normoxic water conditions. You'll have kind of a thick layer of sediment on. You've got the water column where the fish are, and maybe there's a flounder on the sediment surface. There's oxygenated layer, and then there's anoxic sediment below that. And this often happens in lakes and estuaries as well, in spring, summer, and fall. That you have just cycling of the manganese between this oxide or particulate solid form to the dissolved form, and then that kind of cycles around. Some of it might get buried, but that's what we call internal cycling in the sediments. But under hypoxia, though, when if it's hypoxic or anoxic, then this layer gets very, 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 very thin. It possibly goes away, in which case you have a mechanism to diffuse the dissolved manganese up into the water column, and that's what we think happens. How it gets into the water that the fish get exposed to. So, does it mean that we then does the fish is a fish in good water is likely not going to see hypoxia or be exposed to manganese, but in hypoxia they will. Let's see. So then, and we can track hypoxia exposure by manganese in the otoliths. It turns out it's pretty easy to analyze it. And this is a map I made with a synchrotron at Cornell. These are called elemental maps, and basically we can fluoresce high energy. We can expose a sample to high energy X-rays, and we can map right across it and look at whatever elements get excited by that X-ray fluorescence or X-rays. And what we saw here for a juvenile cod, a cod that was born this particular year, 2008, and was caught in the fall, that in the summertime, the manganese went up, like seasonal hypoxia, and declined in the fall. And for strontium, which is an element that we look at for movement a lot because it follows salinity gradients by and large, we can see that this fish is strontium in ratio to the major element calcium increase in the fall, and that implies that this fish was going into probably deeper, colder water. So we can read things like this, and then we can see that this cod that's a 1-year-old cod experienced 2 of these. So it was born in low salinity water and made a directed movement out of there after about a year or so. But it also it was born in the spring in probably good oxygen water, hit some hypoxia in the summertime, was relieved in the first winter, and then looks like it had a bad bout of hypoxia the second growing season, and then that let up at the end of into the fall. So healthy cod have clear patterns of growth in their ear stones, and poor conditions they have poor patterns, and this is a problem. And we ended up using otoliths and their chemistry to help us figure out the age too. So we ended up developing several indices of hypoxia exposure, like thinking of it like storms. So you think about the exposure, but then also the intensity and the duration. And what I found was for my measurement of duration, if I matched it up to calendar years, it actually matched remarkably well with an independent oceanographic index of hypoxia. This is based on those maps I showed you earlier, that map. So the hypoxia and anoxia volume here would be this blue line. I had to actually lag this 1 year to make them match up, and I think that's because the data are collected at different times of the year. But I was kind of floored to see this because it's not that many fish that I analyzed, a couple hundred or so, and yet we see this remarkable matchup. And so we can see that there was a period of elevated hypoxia, which was reflected in fish, then a period of actually where the water contained a lot of oxygen in the early 90s, and you could see this dramatic change in the earstone chemistry as well. Then I have a gap in my data, but over time into the 2000s, the hypoxia started to increase, and it has continued to increase, but my data set doesn't go that far in this paper. Then a couple other things that we can do as fisheries people is we can calculate, once we know how old they are, we can estimate their size at different ages. And I did that here, and I broke it up by time period. And what we can see is that the most recent time period had the lowest growth. So this implies that something's going on. And we saw that the hypoxia was going on over here, that was on the increase. But even more dramatic than that was that I broke up the data set also by what I called hypoxia exposure group. And what I did was I just broke it up into, okay, in this year, how much of the year were you exposed to hypoxia above some threshold that is based on their age and it's basically their age. And when I did that, I actually saw this. I saw that the least exposed fish were the largest fish. And this is just an amazing relationship that it shows up so dramatically. There's not much of a difference when they're young of year, but as they get older and older, these exposure levels really separate out in terms of growth rate. So the most heavily exposed fish are quite a bit smaller. In fact, they're 39% smaller in length at age 3 than the least exposed, and that results in a 64% decline in weight. So that does have economic implications, right? Because it's biomass, it doesn't actually happen because of that. So biomass is what we fish for. So I have a former postdoc who I'm trying to prod into helping me carry through an analysis on this. So she was hired in our project studying hypoxia impacts on fish communities, and she did some models. And this is Liz here. Liz Dusky is her name, and she's at Ohio State now. But we got some data for we were able, with another former student of mine, to get data for cod, and we can see how the cod prices, have been dropping off over time. But what she's tried to do then is to actually relate the price per kilo to the bottom water oxygen, which is really this is pretty cool. And what we can see is that the early part of the period with better oxygen, the higher the oxygen was, the higher the price. And that we're kind of down in the zone of the doldrums, if you will, now. So this is now what we're trying to do is go to a place, and so that's that threshold we talked about. This is the effective threshold that is used a lot of times for regulating water quality. But some of her preliminary model results were to look at the biomass of cod under the current levels of oxygen and at the time, and then some historical, and look at the biomass, the yield, and the total value. So this is very, very preliminary, but we're trying to get, a little further with it. So that would be some ecological economic kind of thing. And then finally, one more local thing, which is to look at data from the Hudson River estuary. So John mentioned that a lot of ecological economists are up here in the Northeast, and the Hudson River is in our backyard for a lot of us. And they're part of a national estuarine research reserve program run by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. It's one of, I think, 25 to 30 around the country. But water quality has been measured since 1995, and it is measured at 15 to 30-minute intervals, which is pretty amazing. So last summer, I decided to take a look at it, and it's measured up here in a site called Tivoli Bay. There's a monitoring station right here, and this is the open Hudson over here. This is the railroad track that goes up between New York and Albany, the Amtrak track, and then this is a bay here. And so the water sloshes back and forth through here twice a day. So it's, with the tides. So I downloaded the data and I looked at the trends. And what I saw was that there is, if you take all your data, you trended, and then you remove the average, you can look at the differences, what the climatologists like to call it an anomaly. And so 0 would be the same as the long-term average, and a positive number is above the long-term average, and negative numbers are below the long-term average. And what we see is that there's both in terms of the concentration, the milligrams per liter, and the percent saturation, this is going down. And it's rough. If you look at it roughly, it looks like it's about a 2 milligram per liter change over that time, and but even more so, maybe a 25% change in oxygen percent saturation, which means it's much harder to pull the oxygen out of the water, which is important, obviously, for the critters in the water. The temperature was surprisingly not so. This anomaly wasn't so high. This was the highest change I saw in the data. If you look at it across the whole year, it's actually no change at all over those many years. But in the summertime, it does seem like it's. I think I need to drill into it a little bit deeper. But what does seem to be really driving things is something called specific conductances related to salinity. And the water is getting more saline, even that far up the Hudson, which is 105 miles up from the Atlantic. Even there, it's getting more saline. And I won't leave you guessing about it. I'll give you the punchline. It's sea level rise. So the waters from the oceans are coming up, and we know that the fish fauna are changing too. Everything is changing because of that. So things are getting more marine. Although I can't say that it's marine 105 miles up the Hudson, but it is definitely, we can see the changes, and that is most likely driving that oxygen. So to summarize then, oxygen is a critical parameter for most life forms. And I hope I've explained well enough to you the properties of water and the processes that affect it in aquatic ecosystems, and the problems that organisms can face. And it has both ecological and economic implications. And there are lots of variations because of compensation and things like that. So one of the sort of interesting and tricky things about trying to measure impact on fisheries, for example, is that fish, if they can move away from bad oxygen, they will. And they often will just sort of hover around the edges, like in the Gulf of Mexico, they'll hover around the edges of hypoxia and then just make quick dives down to feed on organisms that can't get away and are struggling. So, you may not see a short-term loss. You may see a short-term gain from deoxygenation, but long-term, we kind of know where things are going. And my final point is, there's a challenge out there to see the ecosystems services quantified and evaluated. And this does seem to me to be something that falls in the domain of ecological economists. So that's something to think about, and I hope I've piqued some of your interest. So I'll end it there, and thanks to lots of people and all the funding, and that's about it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see who's out there, and take it from there.
All right, thank you, Karin.
Sure.
Are there any questions? So you can either raise your hand and we'll call on you. You could put it in the chat, however you'd like to. Oh, go ahead, John.
Corinne, you might have mentioned this along the way and I missed it, but did you say there are some kind of solutions to this problem?
Well, I'd say that one solution, there can be solutions, of course, just like there can be solutions to global climate change, which is redo our economies completely, get us away from dependence on fossil fuels. I think that's kind of one of the big key things. What we do know is that oceans, it's a matter of scale. Oceans are huge with very long, slow dynamics. So unfortunately, a lot of the things that we've already done have set in motion consequences that are going to take a long time to resolve. But yeah, there can be solutions for some within scale. So I guess a good example is putting bubblers in farm ponds, right, to reoxygenate them. But can you actually do that with some system that is 1.7 times the surface area of all the Great Lakes combined? I would be really surprised.
Right.
You may be able to pick out spot areas, and I know that one of the things they're trying to do in the Baltic drainage is, reinvigorate the ecosystems of coastal zones, because we know that you get a big bang for the buck from that, and that's essentially what NOAA is trying to do in our coastal zones too. So restoration or conservation and restoration are super important, because a healthier ecosystem is going to have a better chance of being more resilient. And I haven't even discussed things like invasive species that might be more oxygen tolerant than native species, and so on. So there's, you can go on and on and on, but the quick answer is yes, but it's a matter of scale. But definitely we really need to push for lowering greenhouse gas emissions.
May I slip one more thing in about what percent of the ag runoff do you think is the problem?
What
Or,
percent?
yeah, what percent of the problem is ag runoff, and can that be solved?
In
And
coastal areas, it can be I can't give you exact percentages, but we know that it's large, that it can be, you can read papers by people like Richard Howarth's brother, Bob, and his group, and look at their estimations of nutrient loadings into coastal zones. A lot of that comes from, it comes from agriculture and in different forms. So we might think about corn as one of the big drivers, or soybean as another big driver, but actually a lot of it in the Northeast is from concentrated feedlots. So
wow.
yeah, there a lot of cow poop and stuff like that going down. So
All right, thank you.
yep.
Connor, go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, thinking about the threshold of the 2 milligrams per liter, I believe, is there has there been exploration into how do we assess the entity level contribution to that kind of budget or that threshold? So to sort of play on the conversation previously just now,
I'm not sure what you mean.
With John on the percentage of agricultural runoff.
Mhm.
Can we scale, can we, I guess, kind of pinpoint, okay, the large sources of agricultural runoff so that we can understand which entities are contributing more to the issue or not?
Yeah, the answer is yes, and that's what they're trying to do in the Gulf of Mexico, you know.
Okay.
So there's a huge plan in place. I think took years to wrangle it, but there is a huge plan to do nutrient reduction in large part in agricultural lands. But you know, when you talk about that, you also have to remember that concentrations of humans also produce nutrients. You know, so sewage. So we have to make sure that our sewage plants and our combined storm and the way that water is delivered off of streets and into receiving waters is nutrient free as possible. So you know, during storms, a lot of cities in the Northeast are have these old sewage systems that are called combined storm sewers because sewage um, the excess runoff from precipitation can you know, overwhelm sewage plants, so they would just sort of have a sluiceway that bypass things. But there are you know, now I think there are actually technologies for smarter regulation within cities of of some of these overflows, and so they can I don't I've only heard of this. I haven't actually seen this, but I understand that they have sensors to be able to tell when flows are getting excess in one place, and they can try to route water or open up other overflows instead. And they have things like retaining basins, things like green infrastructure in cities. That's to slow down water, you know. So I don't know where you live, but you know, your green space is incredibly important for hydrology. And we know that, again, John mentioned that a lot of ecological economists are living in the Northeast, and we know that the climate projections are for more precip here and in more intense bouts. And if you don't believe me, just look at last summer. What happened with events like going up the Hudson Valley and into Lake Champlain with 10 inches in 7 hours. You know, that's just way beyond the capacity of most of the water treatment facilities to handle that, and so you end up with floods, of course. So you know, the more that we can develop things like green infrastructure, that will certainly help, and to also do things like contain you know, to restore and maintain the health of recipient waters. Absolutely important.
Thank you very much.
As you said, you would have expected temperatures to have a relationship with the issue, and
Oh, it does in many places. I'm just saying that my little case study, the Hudson, did not show so much. The bigger driver in the Hudson was salinity.
do you think that's just a lag?
Yeah, I mean, we know that we know the waters are getting warmer around here, but why exactly it is that the Hudson isn't showing so much, I don't really know. I haven't really dug into it that deeply yet to see. But I know that where you do see an increase in warming temperatures, such as they are, is in the summertime in the Hudson. And if you have an annual average of essentially no change, it must mean that it's getting cooler in some other period, some other seasons. And I don't know enough about it to explain that yet. But you know, it's a very big watershed, and we know that things like snow dynamics have changed up in the Adirondacks. You're not getting as much snow cover, so you're not getting the big slug of fresh water coming down as in the same way in the springtime as you did historically, for example. But you know, I think from an ecological economics perspective, you can say that you know, these are phenomena that you know, well, you know, you can say that there's a cost to the maintenance of the kind of water that we want, and I think it is beyond sewage treatment plants, because you know we want water for ecological uses as much as we want it for drinking and industrial process water.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. I'd heard there was an increase in jellyfish. I don't know if that
Yeah,
was oxygen or
it is kind of related to oxygen. It's probably a combination of losing fish and losing oxygen. For one thing, there are a lot of organisms that eat jellyfish. There are fish and other things, sea turtles, seals that specialize in eating jellyfish. But also jellyfish are interesting in that they have their cells are very well oxygenated. They can store oxygen. Um, and so they are less subject to stress from low oxygen events. So it's kind of both, probably.
and so are there other species that thrive in these environments, and what might that world look like?
Well, look, there's billions and billions of microbes that are anoxic. You know, they love it, and there are many invertebrates that you know, microscopic invertebrates that can do fine. There's you know, in the fish world, there are some fish that are adapted to very low oxygen. These deep water fishes, and there's one fish that became sort of a known superhero. It's a tiny fish in the Benguela Straits called the bearded goby. It's a very small fish, few inches long, and it was discovered that they can exist in no oxygen for days, if not weeks at a time. And what they do is they go down into these deep anoxic zones and hang out and hide from predators. And then at night, at night they go up in the water column and they feed on plankton, I guess, and small invertebrates. But while they're doing that, they're actually also hiding again, because they're small, vulnerable fish, and they hide in the tentacles of man-o-war jellyfish, of all things. So, you know, something that would kill most animals and people, they can hide in. It's really remarkable. But, you know, it's just one species, but still it is kind of an interesting story.
In terms of your final point with the ecosystem services quantified and evaluated, I mean, I think you're 100% right in terms of a nice outlet for ecological economists, as well, you know, using the broad term, because, you know, you would need an economist, we would need people like yourselves, we would need other people to join forces in order to really go about that, because there's so many aspects of it. You know, and you've done some of that. Could you maybe speak a little bit more about that?
Well, in terms of what we've done in our project, or what? Because I mean, one thing about ecosystem services is that although they're somewhat codified by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, I still think that you can cut them out of broad cloth, right? And you can think of something that is a service. And one paper I wrote with some students at the time, I did run a class on thinking about deoxygenation and the loss of ecosystem services. And we worked on Baltic cod, because these students were from Sweden. And we looked at the loss of a biological, a demographic feature of the cod, which was that they lost their maximum length. So, you know, what fish biologists do is they collect a lot of fish and they assess them for age and length and biomass, and figure out how to set quotas and stuff like that. But one of the criteria that you look at is, well, what's the biggest fish? And so the maximum length declined over time. And one of the students modeled this statistically tried to fit the loss of length of the fish as a function of the food it eats, which is herring, the fishing pressure, and then oxygen. And it turned out the most significant factor was oxygen, that the loss of oxygen led to the decline in size. And that is something that some of the other environmental scientists took umbrage with, because they said that we were selling out to the fishing industry. But honestly, the fishing was stopped in 2019 on Baltic cod, and they haven't recovered. It's 5 years and they have not recovered. So I think something else is going on, and that probably has to do with the loss of food resources on the bottom, the benthic food that they ate, the bottom dwelling organisms. Large areas have died out, so they're not available, and their preferred fish prey is the herring, which are moving northward in the Baltic, and that might be because of temperature, possibly. So there are a lot of, lots of ecology is nothing if not lots of complex things going on. But we wrote a paper that was published in Ambio about the services of maximum size of fish. And, it's everything from the contributions they have to the populations of fish themselves. The cod that are larger generally are, older, more experienced, know where the good spawning places are, know how to feed better, reproduce better, have bigger clutches of eggs, things like that. But then also have change, sort of have a different role regulating ecosystems. And then another thing that really was the case in Sweden was it was such an iconic species. And when they were going down the tubes pre-COVID, there were campaigns. There were actually TV ads and radio ads and newspaper poster billboards up on the streets, save the cod. And it was all about, losing these big, magnificent creatures that went away. So that, is I think a cultural service that was threatened. So those are some kinds of examples, I think, that you might not normally think about. But yet many, many other things I think that could be considered would be just some of the conventional ways of assessing value, something like fishing trips for either commercial fishers or recreational, sport fishing and so on. All those things could be assessed, and I think most of them have not been. One of the things that did happen, this is now back in I think 2014 or so, the stock. So a standard thing that's done in fisheries to set quotas is to do what's called a stock assessment, and that is you take a look at the population stock that you're going to fish on, and you figure out, based on its age and growth rates and production of different parts of the population, how much can you actually take. And because cod were doing so poorly, they didn't lay down very good growth rings, so they became virtually impossible to determine ages on, and the assessments depended very heavily on knowing the age of fish to run the models. And because of that, they had to declare a failure. And because of that, they lost their eco-labeling through the Marine Stewardship Council. And at first that had very little impact, but over time it did have an impact. But it's one of a number of things that have happened to those cod, because they're obviously a population under great stress. And not every fish species is as stressed as they are, but they are certainly stressed.
Yeah, maybe if you did like a 2 or 3 stage model, so where you have the I can't pronounce it.
Deoxygenation, that's a terrible term. Yeah.
As the primary aspect, linking that to maybe the fishing and boat trips and things as a secondary, as building deoxys, you know what I'm saying. So
Right, right. Yeah, and again, as we know, people are pretty fickle. That if the fishing isn't good on one thing, they'll have to switch to something else. If they're beholden to keeping their payments up on their gear and their equipment, they are going to go and fish either somewhere else, or they're going to fish, um, on something else. And the same could be said for other kinds of resource exploitation too. But in the case of deoxygenation, that, you can observe things like that. And I think in the Gulf of Mexico, there were some economic studies done of the shrimp fishery. And what was found was that, again, the fishing fleets moved around, following the shrimp that were avoiding the low oxygen areas. And they also were basically waiting for the right price point to go harvest too. So it's definitely more complicated than the ecology alone. But I think it could be a really good topic to study. And again, as I said, it's I think economists that study this kind of thing are good at sort of the short-term dynamics, but taking a look at the macro scale may be much harder to do.
are there any other questions? All right, so want to thank Karin for her presentation today. I think there's a lot of ecological economic applications to the type of work that she does, and I think it gives us a lot to think about as ecological economists. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and I encourage you guys to go find a limnologist. That's somebody who works on lakes and rivers. Hug them and say you want to work with them.
Good suggestion.
All right. Thank
All
you,
right.
Karin.
Yes.
Thank
Yep,
you.
you're welcome.
Thank
All right.
you.
Good to see you guys.
Yep.